now we're in trouble. To the best of my knowledge. Oh, wow.
Calling the Planning, Zoning, and Building Committee to order. Roll call, please.
Alderman Sorrentino. Alderman Jacob.
Here.
Alderman Woods.
Here.
Alderman Sizmarsky. Alderman Roy Wesley. Alderman Eugene Wesley. Alderman Catalano.
Here.
Alderman Messina.
Here.
That's being everyone present. Make a motion to approve the minutes of
Second.
November 14, 2019 for the Planning, Zoning, and Building Committee minutes. We have a second. Any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
That passes. Report and recommendation. Approval of a text amendment for case number 2019-CDC-14 to prohibit the establishment of cannabis-related businesses. Ed, you're going to talk about this one?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So just briefly, this, obviously, as you all are aware, the state law is going to go into effect January 1st, 2020, which is close upon us. This item went to the CDC November the 18th, and the CDC recommended approval, and the approval is to opt out at this time. I just would like to remind everyone that because that recommendation is opting out at this time, that does not preclude us from opting in at a later date. And with that, that's all I have.
Okay. Alderman Messina?
Yeah, for those watching at home, I know I'd gotten some questions for and against, and in the middle, and on every side. Irregardless, to your point, this could be a temporary measure to prohibit that until we're able to collect data, kind of see where the chips may fall, and then make a more educated decision. That was the idea, that was the premise from what I understood based on the recommendation from staff and CDC.
Mr. Cage?
Yes, that is correct. Obviously, we have some neighboring communities that are opting in. This is one of those new laws that I think if you asked anyone what will happen, it's hard to predict. So I think, I know from the CDC standpoint and from staff standpoint, when you're not entirely sure, how the new law is going to be implemented and how it works, sometimes it's better to kind of sit on the sidelines and watch and see what happens with our neighboring communities, and then the option is always there to opt in. So, as you said, sitting on the sidelines, seeing how things work come January the 1st. Some of our neighboring communities have opted out also, and some have opted in. We'll collect data over the year, and obviously, that's something if, from a staff standpoint and from an elected official standpoint, if we see that there's other options down the road, we can always revisit it.
Continue, Alderman Messina.
One follow-up. By no means is this an assumption of my position on this, but the question was asked of, from the state, there is a certain number of licenses, from what I understand, that are granted, and once those are exhausted, that's it. Is that correct?
Mr. Cage?
I'm going to defer that to someone who knows a lot more about this than I do.
Mr. Murmas?
I'll see. Maybe I'll get it correct, but it's my understanding that if you have a medical license, you could get the recreational license at first, and then there is a finite amount of recreational licenses. But even those, I don't think have been allowed yet unless you had medical. Attorney.
They've been granted in other cities, from what I understand. They've been granted, and I was reading something that said they've been granted, and after X number of licenses, there will be a determination. There's going to be a finite number. That was, I don't know, maybe Attorney Bond.
Mr. Bond, do you have?
Yeah, as Manager Murmas indicated, that is in fact the case. I think the state is at the point, they're trying to figure it out too, to determine, what the impact. They started out the medical marijuana with, it initially was a pilot type program with the recognition that if they did not experience some of the problems that where people were thinking with addiction, with, organized crime, with other things that would come to it, that they would expand it into recreational use. So this is following that same path. So I think as Mr. Cage indicated, sitting back seems to make sense because the state's still trying to get their arms around this to decide what to do. And so there are going to be a limit on the number that may expand at some point in time in the future, but that would be up to the state. And as Mr. Cage indicated, you're opting out, really all you're doing is saying, we do not allow that within our zoning. It's like any other use that you've done from a zoning code situation. But to the extent that you would do the examination and study of the other communities and what's happened or any changes in the law, you can always amend your code. You can regulate it by saying where these would be permitted within your code from a zoning perspective.
Okay, Alderman Woods?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion to approve the text amendment to prohibit the establishment of cannabis.
Second.
Businesses.
A couple questions I have, Mr. Cage. Do we have any idea what kind of sales tax rev? For some reason, I heard somewhere, the city would lose approximately $600,000, and I heard that's quite a big number. I'm not sure where I heard that from, but
Your sleep.
Mr. Murmas?
Yeah, that's astronomically high. That's more realistic estimates were probably maybe very low, like around 100,000 potentially at first.
Mayor?
Just so, the other day, I was talking on the news, Michigan, the first month or whatever, made 270,000 in sales tax. So for the entire state, that'll be about $3 million. And I believe there's like 47 licenses. I don't see everybody's gonna make $270,000 if the whole state made everybody thinks this is like a silver bullet and they're gonna take care of all their financial problems. All they're gonna create is more problems for our police departments.
I guess I have one question. I think I talked to the chief about this. If the chief was saying that if somebody gets a license for medical marijuana, they're exempt from taxes. Is that correct, Chief? You had mentioned something like that.
Yeah, that's correct. Under the new law, if someone has a medical marijuana certificate, they are not taxed for it. So the wise ones will likely go out and get a medical marijuana certificate to avoid the 38% tax that's going to be imposed on the sales.
Okay. Thank you. Alderman Sismarski?
Chief, can you answer one question? I have no clue as to the answer. They said the daily prohibited amounts is what?
Chief, go ahead.
So the possession limits are 30 grams for residents and 15 grams for non-residents. And then there's a limit to edibles and a limit to ingestibles too. So.
If you're gonna
Continue.
follow up, what is not, just to educate some of us, you would know better than us, being a police officer. What does 30 grams equivalent to in cash about? What's the ballpark figure or what?
Chief?
Probably right now it's running about $300.
So somebody actually smokes $300 worth of pot a day? Is that a day or per week?
Chief?
That's just possession limits. So however long that takes them to expend it. But street value right now, probably around $300, depending on how much you buy.
Alderman Sismarski?
All right, that is the last question. So between this cannabis release and the state expanding on the gaming, I told 20 bucks in a machine, to 40 bucks in a machine, 60 bucks in a machine, and I'm one person sitting there. I'm not smoking my brains out, but I'm putting $60 in, and we got another machine now. I'd rather take the gaming over the cannabis any day of the week. So I just can't see allowing the gaming or the cannabis at this point
Mayor?
without any further testing, I guess, or answers.
So I've got a question. So we opt out. What about all the products that are gonna start coming up, the gummies and all this stuff? Can those be sold in town? At the stores, gas stations, or whatnot?
Chief?
No, those would have to be sold at dispensaries. The one thing you're gonna see with the new law, though, is they're getting rid of the prohibition on sales of drug paraphernalia, except for like paraphernalia that would be used for ingesting controlled substances. So you're probably gonna see those types of devices pop up a lot more locally at different locations.
Mayor, continue.
No, but my understanding is on some things, CBD oil or whatever the acronym is allowed.
Chief?
So is it two different things? I wanna make sure I understand this correctly.
Sure, so
Chief.
the CBD oil, that's supposed to be lab tested to not have the psychoactive effects that it does. Those are legal right now to be sold. There's certain hemp that's allowed to be sold now. We've actually had some of that popping up in DuPage County, and actually a town, just a couple towns away from us, they were concerned that it was actually the psychoactive THC, but they did have it lab tested, and there was no effects of it.
Mayor, go ahead.
So, and the reason I bring that up is, this morning my wife stops for gas at a gas station, and they got it closed off, and, they're promoting it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I go, it's not even legal yet. I'm not even sure if that's allowed. So I'll be talking to you after, you can go check this facility out for me.
So,
Chief?
CBD oil is allowed, and it's legal?
No, it was gummies.
Oh, okay.
It's some kind of gummy bears or something. I'm like, really? I'm like, all right.
Maybe they were actual gummy bears.
No. She said she saw it this morning, and I'm like, what? Kind of threw me.
We'll talk.
Okay.
Alderman Catalano?
Chief, any new news on new devices, if they're coming up with new devices to test a driver or if it's under the influence?
Chief?
No, there's been a lot of testing on saliva-based stuff. There is a company that says they're coming out with something first quarter of 2020, and if they do, it's going to be in demand certainly all over the country, I think. The one thing we're doing to prepare for this is there's a designation called DRE, which is Drug Recognition Expert. It's really extensive training and very expensive long-term and a lot of continuing education, but there's another one lower level that's called A-RIDE. That's somewhere between field sobriety tests and this DRE, and we've already sent several people to that, and we're going to continue to send as many of our patrol officers to that so they can testify to a higher level of training for impairment in court. But really what it's going to come down to right now is we're going to have to do blood and urine tests if we have probable cause to do so. And if there's a refusal, no different than we would do with alcohol right now, we can go before a judge to get a search warrant if there's enough evidence to proceed.
Thank you.
Alderman Messina?
I think Alderman Catalano touched on this a little bit, but as we go into the new year, and let's say we opt out, can you talk a little bit about the training officers are receiving? Because I'm going to imagine they're going to be challenged and challenged often on the law, and so I just want to make sure we minimize our liability as far as a city.
Sure.
Chief?
So our Chiefs Association has brought in trainers for that. We've already started internal training to cover both our local ordinance and also the state law. So we'll be ready to go. I think what you're going to have is a lot of issues with people either possessing or smoking in places that aren't allowed, because it's not allowed in public. Right. But our people will be ready, but it is going to create a lot of issues, and I think what you're going to see is any cases in the past that might have gone forward for small, let's say, something inside a house or something, you're gonna see judges that are unwilling, you know, you're gonna have a really high level of illegal activity to reach that threshold for any type of search warrant and/or state's attorney to sign on to a prosecution for anything, even though some levels are still illegal.
Chief, I just had one question. Is Elmhurst, for some reason, I heard Elmhurst, all their officers are trained on this, or they have all the specialized training in Elmhurst. Is that true, do you know?
They might have done, they certainly don't have all not all their people are all DREs. I believe Carroll Stream probably has the most DREs in the county, and there's not a lot of towns that even have DREs, because it's weeks of training and continued ongoing training it's very expensive. So that's why we're kind of going in the middle with the A-RIDE training. So Elmhurst might have a couple, but certainly not all their patrol officers. There's no department around that has that.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions. Roll call, please.
Alderman Jacob.
Yes.
Alderman,
Wait, this is for
This
what?
is to,
No, you made the motion to approve, so you're saying yes? The motion was to approve, the motion has to be in the affirmative. so-
Right, the motion was to approve the text amendment to
So-
prohibit.
to prohibit, so the motion would, if yes means you're against it.
Oh, you made a motion to approve, to prohibit.
That's,
Right.
that's
Oh,
how
I
it
thought-
is in the notes.
Okay. I just want to make sure we got that right. I heard you say approve, I didn't hear prohibit.
No,
Here, calm
I read it to make sure it was on the
Just calm
record.
down.
Okay, yes.
okay, Alderman Woods.
Yes.
Alderman Sizmarsky.
Yes.
Alderman Catalano.
Yes.
Alderman Messina.
Yes.
That passes. Next, we have the UDO assessment revisions. Mr. Cage? I'll let you take this.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as you recall, we talked about this in the summer. I believe at the August 15th, 2019 meeting, we authorized our consultants, Mr. Michael Blue of Tesco Associates and Mr. David Silverman of Ansel Blink to do a zoning assessment. I believe some of the comments during the summer were, we want to analyze the UDO because this had come up for a number of different reasons. I know over a period of time we've been processing some pretty extensive text amendments, fences, and some other areas that we've improved, lot coverage being another one. But we've had some discussion on the Thorndale Corridor overlay with some recent developments. Therefore, the City Council approved a contract with Ansel Glink and Tesco Associates to do a zoning assessment, and they are here this evening to give you their findings.
Okay, does anyone have any questions before they give a presentation? No. Okay, let's continue.
Well, hello again. It's good to see you, Michael Blue with Tesco Associates. I'm glad to be here tonight. I'm joined with
I'm David Silverman. I'm a partner at Ansel Blake. We work with Tesca on a lot of zoning code rewrite projects and help with the initial assessment that we'll discuss tonight.
So we provided to you a rather lengthy analysis of the zoning ordinance. Zoning can be a very technical review and a very technical read, and the memo that you got reflected that. So if you found it thick or if you haven't had a chance to read it, we'd like to summarize some of the high points for you, and then are more than happy to answer whatever questions that you have. What did I do? There we go. So first of all, why do an assessment? And in talking with staff, and you all know that the code as it sits now has a number of conflicts in it, things that are internally inconsistent. The one that I think was going on right when we started talking about this was there was a parking issue that was going on that had to do with the underlying code said one thing and the overlay district said another, and those kind of conflicts happen in ordinances, and that's not so unusual, but it's certainly frustrating. The other reason to take a look at it is that the externalities have changed. The world has changed. The market has changed since the Thorndale Corridor District was done, and that underlying assumption has really very much changed and has created some of the issues that you've seen with that part of the ordinance. In fact, what you're doing, and have been doing it effectively from what we're hearing from people, is that using a planned development process to deal with that area. That's great that it's working, but it's not the most efficient and effective way to do it, and we can talk about that a little bit. And ultimately what happens with a code, and what we see is happening with yours, is that it works because your staff is working harder to make it work. So it's a rather inefficient way to deal with zoning processes. So these were the reasons when we first started talking with you that it was important to take a look at, and we certainly agreed. In terms of what we do and how we did this ordinance, there's any number of reviews. There are best practices for how things are done. There are always a lot of options, but there are best approaches to do it, so we look at that. And we take a technical review. So like I said, see if things are conflicting, see if things are consistent, see if it's user-friendly, which is really a word that does apply to zoning ordinances. We did a number of key person interviews. We had a meeting with staff. We met with some developers in the area who are familiar with the code just to get their sense of using it. We listen to everything we hear with a grain of salt, and we process it as fairly and openly as we can. And part of the reason that we work with David and Ansel Glink is that there's a legal aspect to it as well, so that we're able to take a look at that. That legal aspect is one part of the four things that we look for. We always want to make sure that there's value added in the code. If there are regulations in there, are they making the development better? Are they making the city better? Right? That's what it should be doing. Is the process predictable? If somebody reads the code, can they figure out what they're going to go through to get, even if it's a permit for a fence or a planned development? It's got to be predictable for them. It's also got to be predictable for you, because when you all vote on it, you've got to be confident and comfortable with the process that it's gone through. And communication has got to be a part of the process, and that's kind of in everybody's everything, but that's the user-friendly aspect of the code. So that's what we looked at. We want to do the presentation kind of in two levels. One kind of a high-level overview of what we saw, and then we have a few comments on each of the articles, each of the chapters. In terms of Thorndale, and we talked about this even as far back as when we were doing the comprehensive plan together, there's a great vision that's part of the plan for that area, and that's part of the ordinance for that area. What's changed, though, is everything that's happened with O'Hare that was anticipated to happen with O'Hare in terms of the western access. The market for office development is literally gone. We work with market people all over, and they say there is no market. I'm sure you're seeing that here. The market right now is about logistics and industrial. I know you're seeing that here. So it's just a different world than it was. The other question with the district is it's done as a form-based code. Form-based code is a version of zoning that focuses more on the building and its size and its character than it does the use that goes on there. It's very attractive to a lot of communities. It gets a lot of interest from a lot of communities. It works really well in established, developed business districts, downtowns where you want to have the architectural character and height continued. Doesn't work so well in a lot of other areas. It's just not a good fit for what the city is trying to accomplish out by Thorndale, or by the corridor. The town center business district, that's kind of effectively where we are here by Irving Park and Wooddale Road, is also drafted as sort of a form-based established code. It talks about the character of buildings way more than the use. It includes a lot of superfluous information that frankly doesn't relate to the corridor. It's not going to get you the kind of development that you need without having to go through kind of those planned developments. It's better for larger developments. I mean, it worked for the senior project, but that too had to go through a lot of zoning relief and zoning effort. So again, its vision is an all right idea, but the approach is not getting the city what it needs. The land use table, this is sort of the heart and soul of every zoning ordinance. This is the what can you do and what can't you do, what's permitted, what's special, and what's just not allowed. This has some inherent issues in it too. It's very long and very specific. The best practice these days is not to have bike shop, bookstore, camera, or carpet, computer supply. Though, from a zoning standpoint, from a development impact, those are all the same. And so the convention now is to create categories for those so that your districts are more flexible, that you're not turning away businesses that you might otherwise want because they don't fit into these very narrow listings. There's a couple other things that are, just one more thing, Randy. There's a couple other things. There's a lot of retail permitted in the industrial district, which is an issue because you want to preserve that industrial character. Mr. Chair, did you want to take comments as we go? Or?
Yeah, cool. Alderman Messina, did you have something?
So those that brought this or created this years back, I'm sure there was a mindset they had. What was that mindset and what's changed?
It was not unusual for zoning codes 20, 30 years ago to have very specific use lists such as yours. But as we've evolved in how we regulate land use by zoning district, as Michael just explained.
Go to the microphone.
I'm sorry. As Michael just explained, we're moving to a broader categorization system, which avoids the necessity of an applicant who comes in who doesn't quite maybe meet one of these use categorizations to seek a text amendment to your zoning code and have to go through an additional process.
Okay.
So zoning codes are moving to a more flexible model. So what's here is not unusual, and we see it in a lot of codes, but just the trend is to move away from it.
Alderman Messina? One more.
I appreciate the streamline, I appreciate the flexibility, but what liability does that leave us, right? So if things are gray, what's the risk?
Well, that's a very good question. What we do is we kind of do an inventory of what you actually have in the community. That's kind of a key part of this, to understand what business categories, what economic categories you have existing, so we properly account for those. And we use, it falls into the definitions. And an important thing about that is we like to use standardized systems of use categorization. The North American Industrial Standard Classification System is one model that we use, and it has a very precise way to define uses within categories. So you can make these as narrow or flexible as you want. It just depends on what your economic development goals and objectives are.
But there's uniformity as far as I think of legal ramifications, as long as you guys are using a code.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Let's continue.
Thank you.
If we could maybe hold question, do you guys, do we want to ask questions throughout or just wait till then? Okay, let's wait till then.
Fine, thank you. In terms of the standards that are plugged into the code now for all the district, again, this gets back to that question that I mentioned, the point I mentioned about the form-based code. What really drives the structure of much of the ordinance now is building type, and it's just unusual. Part of the issue is not a lot of towns use this. So the developers that work here, the developers that come here, that come before you, that frankly walk into Ed's office, they're not familiar with this. They don't know how it works. The other problem is that there's been an effort to kind of patch it together a little bit so that it does relate back to a district so that it's a little more familiar to people, but that just creates more confusion. The ordinance in many places like this is just confusing to people who come to town to do development. And our experience is that developers that come from someplace else that see a path with some resistance on it are less likely to come to a community. In terms of user friendliness, the code is thick. The code is dense. There are a lot of sections where there are 5 words where there could be 2. It's just hard. It's hard to read and it's hard to navigate. The hierarchy of information from somebody who's looking for, gee, I want to know about accessory uses and home occupations, which are real common kinds of things. You have to find your way into the middle of one of the chapters to find it. And User-friendly codes really highlight those things, so the things that people use most come up first. What happens with these sorts of things is that people go, I don't know, I'll just call the office. And having been a community development director, I've had oh so many of those calls. And what you really want to do is you want to make efficient use of your staff's time to have as many questions answered in the book or on the web as you can without people having to call and ask questions of staff. And if they do call and ask questions of staff, as one client once said, I'd rather have it be a 10-minute conversation than a 20-minute conversation. The zoning ordinance needs to help you do that more. Secondary findings, I'm having trouble here. There are a number of things that we also think you need to take a look at and revise just to make them a little more user-friendly or a little more efficient. We're not going to, in the interest of time, we're not going to go into them here, but glad to answer any questions about them. These are highlighted too in the memo. There are a number of things that, based on our read of them, based on our conversations with staff, based on our key person interviews with members of the development community, your customers, there are a number of things that are working well. Some of them we know from talking to Ed that you have recently updated yourself. One of them is the planned development process, planned unit development process, which you have been using effectively, but you've been using it to work your way around the challenges that are in your code. So you get points for using it well, but you shouldn't have had to be hassled with having to do that.
Yeah, in effect, by doing that, you're creating a zoning entitlement system to navigate around your own regulations by district, by going through a PD process that creates perhaps inefficiencies in your processing of development applications.
So to go through each of the districts, and again, quickly, and we know it was a lengthy memo with a lot of points in it, but as you can tell, there are a lot of things, good, bad, and otherwise that we identified as being worthy of discussion. So the first article is the introduction, it's the intent, it's the purpose, it's the legal establishment that you set up for your zoning ordinance. Again, it's okay, but it's long. It's not as concise as it could be. This is also the section that has the definitions in them. The definitions are really important. As David was saying before, if you go to categories, for instance, one of the ways you protect yourself is you write a very careful definition so that if there is a type of retail use or commercial service that is not appropriate for the city, you can say no based on the way the definition is written. So the definitions are very important. Most of the definitions, quite honestly, that you have now are pretty good. Some of them are kind of old and need to be modernized. You don't see terms like boarding house and convalescent home and nursing home so much anymore. These types of businesses have really evolved, and there's better ways to deal with them is one approach. David?
One of the high-level things we noticed is you're splitting some of your administration and enforcement provisions between two articles. We would recommend consolidating it into a single article. You can delegate selected approvals to the development administrator to build efficiencies in your approval process, most notably site plan review. You have that two-stage process of major, minor. We would recommend, I think we get into this a little bit later, a single site plan review process that can be done through properly delegated standards to the development administrator. We would also just update and bolster your enforcement provisions. They're pretty sparse as currently written. There's a lot more that can be put in there to enable you maximum enforcement capabilities under your code.
Peter says no. Very stingy tonight.
Do you want me to? Oh, okay, yeah, I guess the next two are mine, right? Non-conforming use provisions. These are sometimes some of the most complex provisions in any zoning code because the general public that has to understand how these operate typically don't make distinctions between the different types of non-conforming use categories. So we would definitely suggest a reorganization to treat each type of nonconformity separately, even if to some extent the regulations would be repetitive, but it would be a cleaner presentation. There is a case law reference in it. We would advise not having case law references in your zoning code because the law does evolve and change over time, and then your code is certainly not current with where it might be. You have things that talk about amortization, but you don't have adequate standards, in our estimation, that could help you avoid constitutional and vested rights issues that property owners could assert against you if you're trying to deal with a situation of getting a nonconformity out of an area. And then there's this whole concept of exceptions and powers to grant exceptions to nonconformities. We would advise taking that out and moving it into the variation process that you already have, which is a legally well-tested zoning relief mechanism in proper circumstances tied to specific standards. And I think the next one's fine too. Development review procedures, very important, kind of the heart and the soul of the code. These really benefit from flow charts that people can look at and understand how the process works. Not a guarantee of an outcome, but a guarantee of a process that everyone can understand. We would recommend modernizing your notice standards. You do a couple things. For instance, you require personal notices to property owners within 300 feet. A lot of communities do this. You're not statutorily required to do this. The only community in the state that is required to do it is the city of Chicago. However, again, it's very common to have these, but you can modernize them, so there's no need for a legal description anymore. Illinois state law has been amended to only require a street address and a PIN number. You could also add like a street intersection if that's helpful, but getting rid of the meets and bounds descriptions is one convenient way to help not only the applicant save some money, but also most people read a legal meets and bounds description in a legal notice, or if a personal notice that they receive and they don't know what it is. If you don't provide them with a survey, they're not gonna really know what it is, unless they're an engineer. As I said, consolidate site plan review into a single major site plan review process, and again, we would recommend delegating that authority to your development administrator. And then reorganize each form of zoning relief into a uniform structure within the article. So special uses, variations, planned developments, whatever it is.
And that specifically touches on the section that David just described, specifically touches on what we mentioned about user friendliness. It's just harder to find the information, and when you do find it, it's not entirely clear to the user what aspect of their project they may be dealing with. So the Article 5 on the development districts, which includes the different zoning districts, obviously, is sort of a collection of some of the issues that we've already been talking about in terms of requirements being lengthy, in terms of requirements being a bit on the confusing side to use. Some of the very most useful information for people, for the average resident in terms of accessory uses and such is kind of buried in this section. And it's hard for people to find. So that goes to user friendliness. And this is also a chapter that could just be streamlined, could be just shorter and easier for people to find their way through. In terms of the actual standards for development, again, this is a place where there's this mismatch of form-based codes that start with the building form and land-based codes where they start with the district. And the mix is confusing, and there are some things that are missing. There's no real standard for density. How dense can an apartment development be if that's going to be what somebody does? It's not clear in here. The other thing that's an issue here, again, with organizing by building type, is that there are some standards, again, for the town center business district that just seem illogical. They conflict. And that's a district that I expect if you're doing work in, you're using the planned development ordinance a lot because there's so many inconsistencies within it. David?
Oh, yeah. So you have park and school land contributions for subdividers to set aside those lands for those sites, and that's fine, except it's divorced from any quantitative standard, and that's a problem for you guys, because conceivably, while you can say, all right, your subdivision is X number of lots, you need to give us X number of acres for school and park sites, you're not tying that to a quantifiable standard that all communities who do this typically use. And there is a standard model that's out there. It's called the Naperville model. So what you potentially have is a constitutional taking issue. You could get challenged on that. So we would advise building that into it. In addition, we would recommend incorporating fee in lieu of standards. Some subdivisions just don't have land to give, and it has to be specific to the subdivision itself. You can't say, oh, there's land about 5 miles away we'd like you to acquire for a school site. You can't do that. It's got to be specific and uniquely attributable to the development itself. And sometimes if the development is designed a certain way, there might not be available property for that, perhaps because they need common outlots for stormwater detention, what have you. What we would recommend is a fee in lieu of system where, okay, if you can't give us land, you can give us fee in lieu of, again, tied to quantifiable standards. And then there are certain impact fees you're charging, and not being a home rule community, you may not have the proper authority to be charging some of the impact fees you're charging right now, so you gotta be careful with that. I presume, I don't know the legal history, you may have been very lucky to have avoided this, but it's something you should be aware of, and we would advise you that at least those that aren't specifically authorized by statute, you probably should get rid of.
The last article that we want to talk about, I've really already been through to a certain extent, is the Thorndale corridor. Again, a couple things here. It's just the way that it's regulated is out of step with the way development works now. The setup is just not meeting where the market is. So those are two things that make it difficult for either by right or straightforward development to happen. That's why you're having to do everything by a PUD. And again, you're doing a good job with the PUD, but you shouldn't have to deal with the PUD as much as you do. In terms of the vision for the area, that it is a high caliber, high quality, solid development kind of part of town, that's something that we emphasize in the plan. That's certainly a valid approach, but there are more conventional and more appropriate ways to do that in terms of identifying the area, using some design standards which are currently in the code, and having them be evaluated differently. We don't see that it's necessary to give up the quality of the vision that was identified, but it can be done in a way that's more in keeping with good and efficient development. In terms of the forms of the update, we mentioned this briefly at the tail end of the memo. One approach that communities take in rewriting their code is just to rewrite the whole thing. Is to say, you know what, we're going to just start from scratch, and the things that are good we'll keep, but we may trim them down, make them shorter, make them easier to read, make them more efficient, that sort of thing. And we're just going to do the whole thing. The other way to do it is to just do sections. Pick 3, 5, 2, that's essentially what you've been doing, quite honestly. I mean, I know that, as Ed mentioned before, you've been rewriting parts of it now. It's kind of an ongoing process. The example I always like to use is it's like home repair, right? If you decide it's time to do the kitchen, maybe you just do the cabinets, or if the kitchen is bad enough, you just end up doing the whole thing. That's kind of not a bad analogy for this. And so that's something, though, that is every community's choice. So that's it. Again, we know that there was a lot in the memo. We know there was even a lot in the presentation. We very much enjoyed working with Ed and staff and folks in evaluating what you've got, and hopefully gave you some things to think about, and we're glad to answer whatever questions you have, Mr. Chair.
Okay, questions? Alderman Messina, you had some questions?
Just had one. Talked about in the non-conforming lots of modernized notice provisions. What do you mean by that?
Well, I did touch on it. It was specific to any kind of notice you have to send out for zoning relief. So right now, your code requires like a legal description and things like that. All you need to do now, based on changes to Illinois state law within the last 5 or so years, is just an address and a PIN number. That's like one thing.
Like omni-channel, meaning like social media, newspaper, article, nothing to do with that?
Nothing to do with that. So insofar as you're using those things to engage the public more, get more public interest in development in the community, that's great, keep doing that. But yeah, on the notices that you send out, that you publish in newspapers and sign postings, those things can be simplified. Also, we would recommend, it's not quite clear in the regulations, but that you put the onus on the applicant to do the personal notice to the properties within 300 feet of a subject property. You may already do that, but just put it in your code, make it clear that it's their responsibility, and that they would have to come to the public hearing with the return receipts, for instance, to prove that they've done it. The one issue with personal notice, real quickly, one of the reasons why we sometimes recommend getting rid of it, is if someone misses a property within that 300 feet circle, that could open up a technical challenge, due process challenge to the proceedings. So just be aware of that.
As far as the district, the overlay district, so you're saying you would rewrite that, just keep the nuts and bolts there, but just rewrite it to make it more user-friendly, is basically what you're trying to do?
That's what we think we can definitely do, is to keep the intent, but to rewrite the approach by which that intent is achieved, so that it's more conventional, more familiar to the development world, and easier for you all to use internally.
Yeah, and I did like the idea where you guys were saying kind of have charts for people, because we have had a lot of people with problems understanding the codes, and our community development director, they've been working on, giving people easy literature to read so they understand step by step what they have to do. So I think that helps even with that as well.
One of the very first things we end up doing when we start rewriting a code is to go to the administrative sections and just do a flow chart of, so you're going to have a variation. Here's what you're going to do. Here's the steps. That's part of predictability, part of user friendliness. Those are all the little tricks that we use to make it more comfortable for people to use.
Mr. Bond, did you have any? I mean, I know we've gone through a lot of changes. Does this all sound?
Yeah, I mean, some of the charts, you need a ruler and a magnifying glass to line it all up. It is a little complex. And I think the comment that was made by Mr. Blue was accurate, and that is, this code has been, and you get a lot of, you get a lot of people coming in for text amendments. That's because of the way the code is structured. But the code's been modified over the years, which if you're doing it in piecemeal, it does tend to invite inconsistencies that are clearly within the code. And my co-counsel, I see, is nodding his head in agreement, so.
Mr. Cage?
Yes, all excellent points. I would just highlight probably two recent cases just to kind of illustrate some of the issues that we run into. Earlier this year, we had Allstate Insurance came in, needed a special use to go into a location, retail location on Irving Park Road. Had to go through a very lengthy process. Obviously took 60 to 90 days. That's something that, I look at what we're discussing this evening. That's something, Irving Park Road is a mixture of services, whether that's, retail, whether that's restaurants, and other businesses as well. So, that's one of those examples that we didn't have a lot of comments. The applicant was kind of waiting for the meetings to come to go through the process to get their COC to open up. And another one that's fairly recent, which actually we had to do a text amendment, then a special use, was the employment agency, Employee Bridge. That's another user. It's a service. It's different from some of our other uses along Irving Park Road. But again, that's a 90-day process for someone to go through, to come to the CDC, to come to committee, to come to the city council. And some of these things should be required to go through this process. But these two uses, from the CDC meeting to committee to city council, there were not any major comments or any major issues. Those are the type of businesses that I get calls from on a regular basis. If we take it from a 60 to 90-day process to a permit and a commercial occupancy certificate, which can happen, a week or two, that's a huge difference. And that's being business friendly for the types of uses that we want. And I think we all know the employment agency went into a building that had been vacant for some time. That's a good use. It brings people in who will use our restaurants, drink coffee from our coffee locations. And, that provides that other element to, people, employees coming into the community that use some of the services we have. So just a couple of quick examples to kind of reiterate some of the things that we've been talking about.
And one thing I talked to you about earlier during the week is to talk to Brad about the budget. As far as the budget, did you talk to him since we haven't talked about the budget yet?
Indeed I did. This is something, perfect timing, actually, because CIP, I know we're due to discuss that soon. We had an in-house meeting just today on that. I did talk to Brad, and that's something we can factor into the CIP. So The good news is we'll be discussing that relatively soon in the new year.
Final question, just looking at the fees, I mean, it actually looks like doing it in sections could end up being more expensive than just doing the whole thing, because we're saying 40 to 80,000 versus 90 to 110,000 to do the whole thing. You know, if we start doing one now for say 50,000, and we don't do it for another 6 months, I mean, fees could go up, and now we could be, so it kind of makes more sense to me to just redo the whole thing.
Chairman, just to kind of answer that point, I know the committee and the council have been here for some of these text amendments that Ms. Chrissy brought before us, very lengthy, very time-consuming on a staff standpoint. Even the simpler text amendments, and I know we've done ones for fences, they are very time-consuming. So my concern is it's great if you take a chapter and you rewrite it. There's a lot more work involved in taking a chapter and amending the text sometimes than I think even someone like I appreciate. So there is an economy of scale for doing the whole ordinance. That's a decision for the council to make. But we have taken significant sections before, and I know at some of these meetings we've had the red line version, and these documents, I think Mr. Blue pointed out, you know, the UDO is a huge document. There is a lot of repetitive information in there. You know, if we were to take that whole document and revise it, redline it, we'd be reading it till, you know, next year. I mean, it's a huge document. There are benefits to economies of scale. Obviously, I think you can gather from, you know, my comment that that makes more sense from my perspective. Obviously, clearly, it's your decision. I think what we've done in the past with some of the text amendments have been very user-friendly. Some of the amendments we've made to the fence ordinance have been really helpful to the residents, and I know they appreciate it. And I think some of the things that we're talking about tonight in terms of the bigger code, the UDO, you know, some of these things will help the residents, which I know that's, you know, we like to do that when it's appropriate and when someone has a good case. You know, I know we had the lot coverage discussion, you know, the push and pull of allowing people to have extra lot coverage but concern about flooding. And I think that was a good example of crafting regulations that allow people to do a little bit more, but responsibly. And permeable pavers, best management practices, things like that. And I think this is a really good opportunity from a planning standpoint to take an ordinance that I really think started out as a really good idea, but over the last 8, 9, 10 years, we've kind of modified it enough that it's really a bit of a Frankenstein ordinance. And when I get asked a question and it takes me quite a while to find it and go through it and understand it and interpret it and make sure I'm correct and check that I'm being reasonable. If I'm having a hard time doing it and our planner's having a hard time doing it and we have to talk about it constantly, that means a resident, a business owner, developer is having the same issue.
Mayor?
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. So if we went with the entire project, how long do we anticipate it would take?
It generally takes in the neighborhood of around 8 or 9 months to do it. It's a detailed process, as you've heard from Ed, as you know from going through it. It takes a while to sit down and write. It takes a while to sit down for staff to read. It'll take a while for you all to sit down and read. And so it's kind of an iterative process. That's where a lot of the time goes.
Okay, so that's 8 to 9 months, and then we're talking about the CIP. We don't have any money. We're not talking about starting this when we go to the new budget, are we? I hope not.
Mr. Murmas?
Sorry, what are you asking exactly?
So
Are you
Pete-
saying
Peter-
not to start it now?
No.
Oh,
Peter
okay.
was just asking, well, is it in the CIP and not, and we're gonna be Ed said we're gonna be discussing it, like, we'll talk about it when we do the CIP, and then when we pass the new budget, we're gonna start. That's not
No,
what,
no, that's not what we're envisioning, but we're gonna put the lion's share of the money in the CIP as it won't even be completed until the next fiscal year starts, but we would start
Okay.
after the council would approve it.
okay. that's-
So,
because
Mayor,
I heard-
to
okay.
clarify that, I just wanted to, I just asked Ed to talk to Brad, just to, is it something we have the money for? I mean, he's been working on his budget to make sure that he
I just
discusses
wanted to make
it.
sure we're not starting in May, that's all.
No.
Yeah.
From a staff standpoint, obviously, the committee is, we have the meeting to discuss it. This, I understand clearly, the zoning assessment was to really, we were tackling a few key issues at that point, the Thorndale corridor overlay being one of them. We've had some meetings and some discussions on those recently. What the assessment told us was there's a bigger issue there. And that's really what we're bringing to the committee tonight, which is there's a couple of different options. By no means is this saying we're going to start this off. You guys discuss it, you have questions. This is really bringing it to you to say, how do we want to go about it? And then the discussion of, how do we budget and all that goes into, is kind of the next step if we decide to move forward with this.
I think we should be moving forward now, because we've been trying to get some of this stuff cleaned up, making it easier, so.
Yeah. With that, I'm going to make the motion to rewrite the entire UDO, and not to exceed the $110,000.
Second.
Okay. Alderman Catalano?
Don't we have to go through bids on this? No.
Any other questions? Thank you, guys. Great presentation. We're going to take a roll call.
Alderman Jacob?
Yes.
Alderman Woods?
Yes.
Alderman Sizmarsky?
Yes.
Alderman Catalano?
Yes.
Alderman Messina?
Yes.
That passes. Next, approval of a sign variance for case number 2019 CDC-13 to allow for a second menu board to be located at 330 West Irving Park Road, Starbucks. That is my motion to approve
Second.
that. Any questions? I see the mayor has his hand up.
Yeah, so I see this a lot at a lot of restaurants. So this will be one of those things we change in the code that we really don't have to come through for another variance. It's kind of ridiculous type of variance, right?
Mr. Cage?
Thank you.
Yes, we hadn't planned it this way, but excellent timing. So, the proposed Starbucks, as we all know, is under construction. I think if you've ever been to a Starbucks or a McDonald's, you know how many cars go through the drive-through. Sometimes they have double stacking lanes. I think the second menu board is for efficiency. This is something that we hadn't come across before until this use. Wasn't really aware that we only required one menu board until this application came in. And I think this is one of those examples of this is a 60 to 90-day process. If staff really has our act together, we can get it closer to 60. But still, this is what staff feels is a relatively simple request. If we were to update the code, for example, and allow 2 menu boards, the process goes from 60 days to essentially a permit, which is, 5 days.
Mayor.
Sign permit.
And you mentioned double lanes. I've seen that in a few places. They got double lanes, so they've got extra. So this stuff will all be addressed now that we're gonna rewrite the whole thing, and how many cars are allowed to stack and all this stuff, right? Okay.
Mr. Cage?
Yes, right now we do have some regulations on that. Is it exactly what we would want and what we would prefer? No. So I'd say that the sign ordinance, there's some elements, just like the rest of the UDO, that are very effective and that work really well, and there's some that don't. This is one we just discovered, and really we've got a use that we want to get established, and they're going through this process, fortunately during construction, but it's a lengthy process for something that from a staff standpoint would be better treated as a permit. So, yes, there's a lot of these things that we're finding in the UDO that we can potentially modify, streamline. Obviously, we still want standards, we still want people to comply with them, but there's some things here that really we can improve on. This certainly would be one of them, so,
Yeah.
very good point.
And with that, Ed, I mean, what I said to you today is, let's make sure it's in the new, I mean, this is what things are happening with your restaurants and things. They need 2 signboards. They don't just, I mean, we should have that already in the code, so we shouldn't have to go through this.
I mean, right, I've been here long enough, I've heard a lot of comments, a lot of good comments about services, restaurants, coffee shops on Irving Park Road. That's what we want, that's what we want to encourage. If we want to encourage it, we have to look at these regulations and say, look, if somebody has a coffee shop or a restaurant and it has a drive-through, does it really hurt to have 2 menu boards versus 1? That just means that they're busier, which means it's a good business. That is relatively straightforward in my opinion.
Okay.
So this is a good example following on the discussion we just had.
Alderman Woods?
Yeah, these are all good problems. And we can fix them in short time.
And I guess one final question before we do a roll call. Once we vote and let's say that we approve this, is it still going to take 3 months, or is there something we could do to streamline this, or is today it?
Excellent question. So what we're looking at today is a variance from the sign ordinance. This is specifically for Starbucks. We don't have any other applications kind of in the hopper, so we have some time to modify the code. Really, I think what we're going to do with, sit down with our consultants, try and brainstorm and come up with enough of these things that we see in other communities or some issues that we have in the code, just like this. Make a list, talk to developers, find out what their issues are, and I know the consultants have done that, and try and come up with a comprehensive list, rewrite the code so that people, whether it's a resident or whether it's a business, don't have to go through this lengthy process. Clearly, if they're asking for special relief from certain standards we have, there's still a process to go through, but some of these things are easier fixes, and this certainly would be one of them.
Okay, perfect. Alderman Sismarski?
Yeah, it's for Pat. Wouldn't be able to go ahead and address staff to alter or change that variance? To go ahead and change it to a second signboard if needed? I mean, it's...
Attorney Bond?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to there's a process for amending the code and making that, and that's what I think they were talking about, incorporating into the revisions. But that has to, by state statute and our code, has to go through a certain process so that you can't just defer that to staff to make that call.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Just like parking variance.
Okay. Roll call, please.
What are you saying?
Oh, wait. I'm sorry, Mr. Murmas.
For Attorney Bond, legal question, can Alderman Messina and Jacob vote if they have Starbucks cups to recuse themselves?
Well, it appears as though we have 2 Starbucks cups, so that would be consistent with the second signboard that's being requested.
Recuse yourselves?
Alderman Catalano, do you have something before we?
Director Cage, what is the estimated time when that's going to be completed?
The answer that I want to give you is ASAP. This is, there's a number of things that the developer has found during the construction process. It hasn't gone as smoothly as we would like. Obviously, they're moving along. The last estimate they told me was February, March. A key component of this site will be the pavement. Obviously, we're after Thanksgiving. The plants are closed, so really, I think that they will be doing as much work as they can inside, obviously during the winter, but I know they've got some forms up for the paving, but right now, you know, with the weather the way it is, you know, you don't want to be paving at this time. So we have stressed to the developer that everybody is watching. It's a very prominent location, which is a good thing, and hopefully this will be up certainly early next year in the spring.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's take a roll call, please.
Alderman Jacob.
Yes.
Alderman Woods.
Yes.
Alderman Sizmarsky.
Yes.
Alderman Catalano.
Yes.
Alderman Messina.
Yes.
That passes. Next, items to be considered at future meetings, engineering standards, January, February, SBT bank development, February. Do we have anything to add? I guess the mayor has one to add, or two?
That's a pass.
Okay.
I'll bring it up at CIP.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to make a motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting, anyone opposed? We're adjourned.
I'd like to call to order a Public Works meeting, committee meeting. Minute taker, please take note that the same council members are present. And I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
November 14th, 2019. That is my motion. Any questions? No questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next is report and recommendation, approval of amendment of the professional services agreement with HR Green, Inc. for the clock tower northwest corner and northeast corner of Illinois Route 19, Irving Park at Wooddale Road, in the amount not to exceed $74,000. Director Lang, you have,
So moved.
want to touch on that?
Second.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So just, as everyone will recall, there
That was his
were,
motion.
Yeah, I'll make the motion, but
Second.
go ahead. Second?
Then they
Okay.
talk.
Go ahead.
as you'll recall, there were several delays in the construction of the clock tower at the corner of Wooddale Road and Irving Park Road. Through no fault of the engineer, these led to some overages in their agreement with us. These overages were anticipated by staff and were accounted for in the liquidated damages which were assessed to the contractor. So we are asking that you approve those amendments to that agreement with the engineering firm.
Okay, any questions? No questions? Roll call?
Alderman Jacob.
Yes.
Alderman Woods.
Yes.
Alderman Sizmarsky.
Yes.
Alderman Catalano.
Yes.
Alderman Messina.
Yes.
Okay, motion carries. Next is items to consider for future meetings. Elizabeth Drive Bridge, that will be coming up January or February. Any other items to consider? No? I'll make a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.
I'd like to call the Finance and Administration Committee to order. Let the minute taker reflect that all the same members are present. First, I'd like to make a motion to approve the meeting minutes of November 14, 2019.
So moved.
Second.
Any questions, changes, corrections? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That passes. Next, report and recommendation. This will be pretty exciting. Property casualty and workers' compensation insurance renewal. Take it away, Kate.
Thank you. Every year, as you know, the city must renew its property casualty and workers' compensation insurance. We have been using Alliant Messero as our broker since 2013. This year, they did a softer outreach after having 2 years of heavier outreach. In your packets is the premium summary for the current year's pricing proposal versus last year's pricing proposal. You will see it did go up. The overall premium increase is 6%. We can certainly, I'm happy to take questions, but we are here to ask the council to approve the renewal.
I'm gonna be like Peter, no question. Peter?
Being in the business, I will say 6% is, I've heard of schools with a 70% increase, and especially with all the natural disasters going on right now, so 6% is really not much of a increase compared to what's, considering everything else that's going on. And
All the earthquakes Wooddale has? Yeah, it's crazy.
Mayor, please.
Yeah, Kate, I think I believe I asked Brad, the next time I'll direct all these questions to you. Are we gonna go out to bid? Brad said we might be going out to bid next year, correct?
Yes, we are planning to go out to bid, do an RFP for an insurance broker next year.
Okay, because I had asked him, I'm like, hasn't it been a few years? And he said, we're gonna go out, I believe, next year. Okay, just wanna, even though it's, I mean, it's 30,000, but sometimes when you go out to bid, you end up being cheaper than where you're at now.
Alderman Messina?
I was just waving my hands, but I had no questions.
I make the motion to approve.
Yeah, but there's no price on that, though.
509,591, correct, Kate?
Yes,
That's
correct.
for- That's our cost?
Yes, that's correct.
Do we have a motion? Did we get a second?
No, we didn't get a second.
Second.
Now we got a
Any other?
I mean, I should probably ask it. So,
I didn't know if you were waving or.
no, I know, I hasn't. So, I mean, is it common practice, right? So the way I saw it stack, and talking to my fellow alderman, is you're at the last year of a contract, you stack it high, and you know you're gonna come for a rebid. So I don't know, to me, it's just bad practice. I don't know, I know Alderman Jacob disagrees, but I don't know, did you guys compare this? Is this typical? It just, I don't know, it doesn't sit well with me that the last year of this agreement, they jack it.
No, we've had an increase every year.
Not this high. It hasn't been this high, though. This is the highest increase. According to Brad, I thought this is the highest increase we've had.
I believe this is the highest increase, but last year we had a relatively similar increase as well. We've
this is the highest.
had an increase in workers' compensation premiums. The good news is, though, that that's based on the past 4 years.
Yeah.
And we had just a couple of large cases which really affected us. And the past 2 years have been trending very positively in our favor. So that's,
So it's a weighted average?
yeah.
No, that's okay. So I was gonna interject, so that's part of the problem is when you're in the pool, is the weighted average and how many claims there are and are there some big claims? So that
Okay.
can skew how that goes. And we've been lucky enough that it's been smooth sailing, if you will, for a couple of years. And now there was a couple of hits to the pool, as I understand it. And so, and market-wise, if you look at that number, I don't think it's out of line. Mayor, please.
And I'll go with the subject we had earlier about cannabis. I believe we still have a zero tolerance for employees who operate machinery and all that stuff coming up after January 1st.
That is correct.
That's nice.
Yes. Until we get further instruction by the state, it's still zero tolerance.
No gummies at lunch.
Alderman Smartsky, did you have a
Yeah,
question?
you know, just to touch on that, is it zero tolerance for city employees, public works employees, police? Yeah, I mean, what is the whole gamut? 100% city employee, and then alderman? And city attorneys?
Unfortunately, that's not an agenda item, so.
No, I just want to know, is
I
that,
could
is
see
that the
this
common
devolving
practice?
into a longer conversation, but
I just want to know if that's
Yeah, it's
common
not
practice.
allowed.
I
It's
know
not
you, I never even,
Drag it backwards.
and I never even knew what, sometimes it's not followed by, it's not recommended, or they just don't have it, so it's good to know. Thank you.
Okay, so back to this matter, we have a second, roll call.
Alderman Jacob?
Yes.
Alderman Woods?
Yes.
Alderman Sismarski?
Yes.
Alderman Catalano?
Yes.
Alderman Messina?
Yes.
That passes. Next, property casualty, or no?
Wrong.
Yeah, property casualty and workers' compensation.
No.
Done.
About CIP?
Oh, CAP. There you go.
You eating edibles?
You got gummies over there?
Items to consider for, yeah, CAP and,
RFP?
Do we need a Starbucks or? Okay.
the mayor's wife,
Got gummy bears down here.
the mayor said, here, you eat them.
She was very upset this morning, let me tell
And
you.
RFP for auditing services, February and March. Is there anything else anybody would like to, add? No? There being none, I'll make a motion. to
Second.
adjourn.
Dump Mr. Woods out. Second.
All right, thank you, buddy. All
I
in
was.
favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned.
Make sure we don't go back.
Yeah, we were going backwards on the, marijuana, but,